Welcome to this episode of Compliance Lab, and welcome back. You have myself, Sarah Sawyer, an attorney at Offutt Kerman, and Rose Mesina, who is an economist and director with Resolution Economics. And today we are going to be continuing our conversation regarding data and compliance and all of those kinds of fun things as it relates to reductions in force, terminations, separations. In the past, we've talked a little bit about auditing current practices and how to use data for being prepared and having a good sense of what data you have and what you might want to do with it. Well, now we're talking about now the time comes, and we talked a little bit about this in the last episode, but want to dig a little bit deeper into when you're actually trying to make these decisions and you're looking at your data and you're looking at the field in front of you and saying, all right, we have to make this decision. We have to let go these 60 people. We have to do this for whatever the reason might be. And there's a lot of reasons to do that. Well, we have this data, we have this information, we have laws we need to comply with. Where do we start? What do we do? I'm sitting there and I'm like ready to make that tough decision and I have to move forward. And I know I've got all this great data and I've been doing all my preparedness like I'm supposed to. Where do we start, Rose?
Yeah, so the very first thing is have a clear definition of what the action is, right? Because when you're considering a RIF, let's say due to financial reasons, we talked earlier in our previous episode that, okay, you might decide that you'll actually pivot to a wage reduction instead or an hours reduction. So whatever the decision is, have that final decision in your mind. And then from that point on, then you know what the next steps are in terms of data analysis. From my perspective, the data analysis that you'll need in a separation or a RIF or the termination situation, you'll want to consider potential discrimination claims that can arise later on or any wrongful termination claims. So how you prepare for that is look at statistical techniques that will pinpoint you to your most risky area. So a simple one that's actually pretty easy to implement would be what we call the impact ratio, which is essentially just comparing the selection rates between two groups. So let's say you're concerned that you may have some age discrimination claims come out of this decision, then you can look at what are the selection rates between younger and older employees. Do you truly have a potential problem? And you might not. If you do, then you can identify, okay, are there specific departments? Are there specific groups that we need to be concerned about? You can use that impact ratio approach for that. But the drawback for that approach is it doesn't really account for any of the underlying decision-making process. You're really just looking at two percentages and comparing them and looking at whether you're comfortable with the difference. But there are more advanced statistical techniques like multiple pools analysis or logistic regressions, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's a statistical tool that's able to account for all the underlying decision-making process that you went through your preparedness process. But the tricky thing with that is that it has more complex data requirements and the computations are usually a little bit more complicated. If you came into this process well prepared and you know where your data is, then you're halfway there. But aside from potential discrimination claims, you can also think about maybe some of your wage and hour risks. From the data perspective, we always recommend regular payroll audits, but I think especially in a RIF setting where you could have heightened risks from an employee who is terminated and who is understandably so wanting to figure out what their final paycheck looks like, you want to make sure that your payroll systems are spitting out correct amounts, you're doing them on time, and you're calculating your rates correctly. So that's another data piece that you'll want to look at when you take all of these actions.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the two categories you bring up are, from my perspective on the legal side, when you take that data and you start taking those next steps, looking at it as a starting point and then layering in the analysis. On the wage and hour piece, that analysis piece can be a little bit more straightforward. We're layering in the law and whether what you're doing is correct based on what the law is. But the numbers are the numbers, the hours people worked, the way that they worked, whether they were exempt, that's a little bit more of a factual analysis. Whereas with the statistics as it relates to looking for potential discrimination trends or things that might look problematic, there's a lot of facts you end up wanting to layer into that because there could be business reasons, there could be other reasons. The stats are really only the beginning of the story, not the end, but they are obviously a very relevant piece of looking at that. But you might have a reason drilling back down on the facts to say, all right, well, the stats look bad. but here's the story behind the stats and why this particular division, while it's an older division than this other division that we're not touching, here's what they do versus what this other division does. And here's why we need this one and not that one. And start layering in that analysis. And so that if something were to happen, because really a lot of this from my perspective as the attorney is to say, we still might need to make the same decision based on our business reasons, but we need to understand what this looks like so that we can back up our decision if we need to, if someone were to file an action or if something were to happen. And so you might end up at the same decision. It might change your decision also. There are situations where it changes your decision making because the risk is too high or because it exposes a blind spot and it causes an employer to look at something a little bit more critically. So there's times where it changes the decision. There's times where it just ends up being a part of the decision-making process and a part of documentation and being ready for any potential action. There's those practical pieces that come into play. And even taking that practical piece a bit further, obviously, when we're talking about employees, and employees obviously are humans, a lot of us employ AI as well now, but in this context, we're talking about human beings who have emotions, they have stressors, they have families they need to take care of, they have mortgages, they have all of these things, which is what makes these decisions very hard a lot of the time. But it's also part of the thing that you need to consider, and you would be remiss to not consider and just look at the data and go full steam ahead without thinking about, all right, obviously when these things happen, people aren't always very happy. And if they like their job and they were expecting to stay there, they could be upset. They could be looking for work. They could be feeling financial pressure. So it's even another reason to do that risk analysis and take a look at that and say, all right, we've got a group of people who may feel disgruntled or upset or frustrated or under pressure. And those types of people are much more likely to start looking under the hood of the business and what you're doing than the people who are happily working and doing their thing, right? There's going to be an intense amount of scrutiny. A lot of times folks might be terminated in a RIF and they'll go to an attorney and say, I don't know what to do. Is this okay? Did they do this right? And so it's really important if you do look into that data and discover either one of the trends you described, or if it's a wage and hour issue. Let's say you're not doing those regular audits, which I agree with you, Rose. Those are things that you should be doing. You shouldn't wait to do that. You should be regularly auditing those, checking with experts on lawyers and making sure you're paying people correctly, making sure things look proper and that there aren't any mistakes. But if you're not doing that, or let's say it's been a little while since you've done one and you discover that there's an issue, that maybe you're terminating or laying off 60 people and all of them are hourly workers and maybe you didn't calculate their overtime correctly, just as an example. That's a problem at a scale where you now have 60 people who are in that disgruntled looking under the hood category potentially, who would love to find something like that. Yeah. And depending on why you're doing the RIF would depend on how you're going to handle that. If you discover that type of issue, it might be something that you keep in your back pocket, know that it's an issue that you might have to confront, or it might be something that you try to address. For instance, we'll see reductions in forces sometimes with a merger or an acquisition. And that might be something you need to confront head on as part of that process. There's a lot to consider. We keep coming back to a very similar theme, is that the more you know, the better off you are. It can be scary sometimes to look at the data and realize these things and uncover something, because humans are running the management of these companies as well. And so there can be sometimes a want to say, I don't know if I really want to see that because now I have to deal with it. But I think really the moral of the story that keeps coming up in our episodes is, the more you know, the better off you are, and the more that you can plan, account for it instead of it coming at you unexpectedly.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to know for the first time when there's a claim. You want to know ahead so you can think through it and what the plan is. So yeah, I definitely agree for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I'll mention before we wrap up this episode is something also to consider in addition to the things we mentioned, is always have to make sure you're looking at also what that pool of employees looks like, whether you're triggering any local or federal laws around notification to those employees. In this episode in particular, we're talking a little bit more about larger scale layoffs and reductions in force, and those can trigger WARN Act obligations, state, federal, which WARN Act is essentially having to put notice out there ahead of time. High level, you can't just lay off 100 people tomorrow, right? Usually you end up having to put some type of notice and comply. And also depending on, we've talked a lot in these episodes episodes around older employees, which under the law is considered employees over 40. But there's special requirements with that. Definitely want to be mindful of those things as well. Whenever you talk about RIFs, if those two things don't come to mind as a lawyer, then those are always the things that come to mind first.
Yeah.
Definitely want to make sure you're looking those things up as well.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Rose, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Sarah.